حضور كريم، مرحبا بكم في أول أيام رمضان الذي نتمناه أن يدخل عليكم بالصحة والسلامة والعافية. رمضان مبارك للجميع. بما أن محاضرة اليوم سيمنار اليوم سيكون باللغة الإنجليزية بما في ذلك التعقيب، اسمحوا لي أن أقدمه باللغة الإنجليزية. Today's seminar will address an issue of great importance to the Arab region, that of great power competition between the United States and China. Both powers have economic, strategic, and geopolitical interests in the region. However, they do differ in how they carefully frame it in their public discourse. So, to help us go through or see through their narratives, we are very pleased to host Dr. محسن صلحدوت, who is on a short research visit from a Chinese university. Dr. صلحدوت, he's an assistant professor of international relations at Sheiān, Jieaotong, Liverpool University Department of International Studies. Prior to his current position, he taught international relations at the University of Queensland at the Australian Catholic University. His main research includes foreign policy analysis and diplomacy. He particularly focuses on the US and China's presence in the Middle East, and examines complex security issues such as states' interactions with non-state actors, including the use of AI-enabled methods for early warning and strategic oversight. In today's seminar, he will present in about 40 minutes one of his ongoing research projects titled Clashing Narratives, a Role, Theoretic, and Critical Discourse Analysis of US-China Diplomatic Competition in the Middle East between 2011 and 2024. We're also pleased to have with us Dr. عماد Mansour, Assistant Professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, to discuss this seminar. I will present him later. So the floor is yours. Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Arab Center for hosting me for 4 weeks here. They have afforded me the opportunity to present my research here, exchange views with colleagues and researchers at the Arab Center. So, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on the paper that I'm presenting. I'm pretty sure I can take lots of notes for my paper and my research. So the topic that I'm presenting today is about US-China competition. Usually when we look at the literature, the research on US-China rivalry in the region, we see that there's a lot of research on hard power rivalry between US and China. So there's a lot about trade, there's a lot about military bases, and how perhaps mainstream IR theories, realism, liberalism try to explain how China and US are competing against each other in the region. What I'm doing in my paper is I'm trying to conceptualize competition as a discursive project. So I'm trying to show how the diplomatic narratives between these two major powers actually demonstrates the rivalry between these two states and how they are expanding their influence in the region. So in other words, it is pretty much a constructivist approach to major powers' presence in the region. There are concepts of power borrowed from mainstream IR theories, but basically it is a concept that is socially constructed in the region, the roles of these two major powers that we're going to talk about. So this is pretty much what I'm going to do today. I'll start with the puzzle, how US-China, the Sino-American competition has been defined by other scholars, and how, where is the gap in the literature? What remains understudied by scholars of international relations? The framework that I'm going to use, I say a few words about the theory, the concepts that I'm using, and also about the methods of research that I'm going to use in my paper. So, as I mentioned, it is pretty much like when we look at the current research on US-China rivalry, we see that there is a lot about material rivalry between U.S. and China. But diplomatic narratives, in my paper, argues that it stabilizes the competition or the rivalry between U.S. and China. Diplomatic narrative tells us what is going on and what is legitimate in terms of policymaking in the region. So again, one other perhaps significant difference between what I'm doing with previous literature is that we often see U.S.-China competition in a dyadic way. It is U.S.-China competing against each other, often treating other states in the region as downstream alignment or passive actors. But what I'm doing here in my paper is trying to highlight the role of actors in the region, how they actually recognize, perhaps contest the role of major powers, and how they might hedge or try to balance their relations between these two major powers, as a result of which we see some sort of re-scripting of the roles of these major powers in the region. So that's another aspect of the paper, that I try to highlight the role of regional actors, how they see, from perspective of the regional actors, how they see the competition between U.S. and China. And of course, the material framing of U.S.-China competition or the strategic competition between U.S. and China, it is helpful, but it is incomplete. It is helpful in the sense that I can, for example, give you an example. I'll refer to that later in the following slides. Like, we might always try to see U.S.-China competition when we look at Saudi Arabia in 2023, 2024, 2025. We see that even the material relations between Saudi Arabia and China has been increased. In 2023, we saw 3.1 times, like the trade volume between China and Saudi Arabia was 3.1 times the trade volume between China and U.S. In 2024, it was increased to 4.1. In 2025, it's 4.8. So Saudi Arabia is pretty much accepting the Chinese role in the region, even in terms of material power. So.
You can go ahead.
Can I continue? Okay. All right. So, if can you see? Okay. So the question is not how discourse replaces material power. The question is how discourse or foreign policy narrative actually legitimizes the roles that these major powers are playing in the region, or how these roles are negotiated through discourse, the foreign policy discourse by the major powers in the region. Yep, so the research question that I'm addressing in the paper is how do U.S. and Chinese diplomatic discourses construct, justify, and contest strategic competition in the Middle East through role performances, and how do key regional actors recognize, contest, or hedge in response to these role claims. I'll explain role theory shortly and say why I have chosen this theoretical concept, why it is helpful, but these are basically the three main arguments that I had hypothetically for the paper. The first one is that competition is best treated as a contested discursive project. It has to be narrated, legitimated, not assumed. So major powers get to choose their roles in the region, but it has to be recognized, contested, or legitimated by regional actors in the region. That's the first argument. The second one is that there are two durable role performances that structure rival diplomacy. U.S. as diplomatic norms promoter, China as developmental partner. When we look at foreign policy texts, official statements by the officials of the two countries, we see that this is pretty much the roles that they are trying to perform in the region. The third argument is regional actors are not passive audiences. They play an active role in re-scripting, in accepting, or perhaps contesting the roles of major powers in the region. So the conceptual move or the role theory, I tried to show that through some graphic pictures so that it's more understandable. So in role theory, we say that all states have got a menu of choice. It looks as if you go to a restaurant, you want to choose something from the menu at the restaurant that you want to use. In foreign policy or in international politics, we say states have a choice of menu. And depending on their power capability, depending on their position, relative power to other states, the size of the state, their population, their economy, they have limited choices. So there are a number of choices for each state in international politics. When they adopt a role from that menu of choice, they want to pursue that role in international arena. They want to pursue the roles, and each role has got some features. Major powers get to choose their roles more freely compared to small powers. Small powers, when they want to choose their role, they often get contested by major powers. A very good example related to today's news perhaps is Iran's choice of becoming a nuclear state. When Iran wanted to become a nuclear power, it got rejected by major powers in the system. US, China, Russia all disagreed with Iran becoming a nuclear state. But major powers, when they want to do something, when they adopt a role, they have more freedom. But it doesn't mean that their role adoption or assumption of the role is not contested by small states in the system. So there is like a continuum of power in international politics. Major states adopt the roles more freely, but still it gets renegotiated by small powers in the system. So we have had U.S. foreign policy narrative adopting the role of democratic norms promoter. China has been trying to be a developmental partner at least since 2011. They adopt the role gets contested, accepted, or renegotiated by the regional states. So we see recognition, contestation, and hedging. So we all know recognition that small states might accept, for example, U.S. as a security provider in the region, or they might reject the role of U.S. as a security provider in the region, like Iran tried to contest the role of the U.S. in the region for long. But hedging is when these small states try to balance their relations between these major powers. Saudi Arabia, for example, could accept U.S. as a security provider, but at the same time, they choose China as their largest trading partner. So that's what hedging means here. So roles are, it's not me. So roles are relational and socially validated concepts. That's what I'm actually stating or arguing in the paper, is that roles are validated. Even if major powers have more freedom to choose their roles, it should be validated by the regional states in the region. One point that I have to add here, perhaps, is that, first of all, we're not going to test the truth of these role adoptions in the international system. We're not going to judge whether U.S. has been honest with the role. Like, if they claim that they're going to promote democratic norms in the region, are they actually doing that or not? That's not the point of discussion in my paper. Or if China is trying to say that, okay, we are a developmental partner for states in the region, is that true? Is it like absolutely an honest argumentation or not? What we are saying, what we are going to do in my paper is that we just want to do this discursive analysis to say, okay, this is what U.S. claims, this is what China claims. So we're not going to talk about the truth of these. And the other one that I should perhaps mention here, and I'll point to that later, is that this paper is like the overarching paper for a big project. So the focus of the paper is basically about major powers claiming the roles, and then small states in the region accepting, contesting, or hedging these powers. But then I will have some in-depth analysis of each cases that I'll refer to later, like Qatar-China relations, Kuwait-China relations, Saudi Arabia, Iran. But the focus in this paper is basically how these major powers articulate their roles and how it is accepted or rejected. So The key role theoretic moves that we are using in the paper starts with role claiming, how major powers claim a role, how they alter caste, how they prescribe roles for their rival or even other states in the region, and how the role is contested by other states, both regional states and the rival powers in the region. So I already mentioned U.S. has been trying to play the role of democratic norms promoter. China has presented itself as a developmental partner, and each role implies expectations about what regional states should be. If they're looking at regional states as security partners, trade partners, so there are a set of expectations also for regional states. But why does it matter? Because role legitimacy is negotiated. Yes, major powers get to choose their role. Their roles is not imposed on them, but it is legitimated by the powers in the region, by the regional states. So audience uptake can stabilize a role. When U.S. claims to be a democratic norms promoter, the role becomes stabilized when the majority of regional states actually agree with that or try to accept that role adoption by U.S. or China. So sometimes maybe regional states might force actually adaptation even under material dependence. Again, the good example was how Saudi Arabia has been trying to balance its accepting the role of U.S. as a security provider, also accepting China as a trading partner in the region. Or we can see even UAE is accepting U.S. as a security provider in the region at the same time, even though U.S. has criticized UAE for approaching China for communication technology. UAE's partner for high-tech communication is China. Hawaii is doing lots of projects in UAE, despite U.S. rejection of Chinese influence in the region. So the point that I'm highlighting in the paper is that these roles appear in bundles. So when we look at foreign policy statements by U.S. and China, we see that there are bundles of roles for each of them. We look at the democratic norms promoter adopted by U.S., we see there are references to values, rights, democracy, security partnerships, coalitions, leadership, and rules-based order. This is what we see when we do the discourse analysis of political texts related to U.S. When we look at China's articulation of the role, we see that the role bundle includes development, connectivity, sovereignty, non-interference, multipolarity, and governance reform. So these role bundles appear, but the sequencing might be different. This is another point that I will raise later in the paper, is that we see the bundles, but depending on the situation or the circumstances, the sequencing or the urgency of these bundles might actually differ. So these bundles are recurring clusters of themes that co-occur and function as warrants for role adoption, role contestation of major powers. The periods, the time frame that I'm looking at consists of three important periods, and I'll explain why these are different periods. So the first one was 2011 to 2016. This was pretty much post-Arab Spring, or in the wake of the Arab Spring, some revolutions happening in the region, some other states experienced some turmoil, internal dissent. So that was a very important time frame, the first one. Particularly because we heard about U.S. foreign policy. The grand strategy of U.S. was shifting towards the idea of pivot to Asia. And around the same time, China developed the idea of the BRI initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. So the first period of time is pretty much about the bundle formation. That's about the time we see both U.S. and China try to put these roles together as a bundle, and we see that in the foreign policy texts of these two. The second period, from 2017 to 2022, that's when Donald Trump came to office, and of course, he appeared as an anomaly in a U.S. foreign policy establishment. He did things that was very much different in terms of foreign policy. When we look at how he articulated U.S. role, he wanted to withdraw from international organizations. He wanted to pull out of some regions which used to be strategically important to the United States, but he defined the U.S. role in a different way. But he did not depart from those basic roles that we often use for the United States, or what we see for the U.S. role adoption. At the same time, we see that China tried to sharpen its role adoption. So the competition was pretty much sharpened this time. Donald Trump was criticizing China. China was more present in the region. We saw the strategic cooperation agreement between China, Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran. So we had this long-term 25-year agreement between Iran and China, initiated in 2016. So that period was also important because it was the time that both of these two powers were trying to sharpen their own role adoption. The third one is during Biden's administration. So it was the time that these two major powers were trying to gain legitimacy of their own roles. There was intensification of legitimating the roles of these major powers in the region. And we could see explicit omni-alignment or hedging by the regional states. So they experienced Donald Trump for the first term. Perhaps some of the regional states realized that they cannot rely on the U.S. anymore as they used to, so they started hedging in the third period. It was during Biden's presidency, because a lot of actors in the region feared that they might see another Trump presidency, which actually came true, and then they wanted to be secure, at least in terms of trade, in terms of security. So after connecting the discursive shifts to broader crisis dynamics and policy repositioning, this is the data that I actually use for analysis in the paper. It's great power discourse, how they actually articulate their roles, both U.S. and China, high-level speeches and statements. I look at foreign ministry statements, speeches, State Department readouts, strategy and policy documents, UN General Assembly or the Security Council, minutes of meetings, how they are discussing, how they are actually projecting their role in the region. And so for the audience or the regional states, the corpus is not just randomly choosing states' foreign policy statements from the regional states. So that's slightly different from the text that I use for major powers. For regional states, I try to look at high signal matters. So if regional states explicitly referred to the roles of U.S. and China, I use the text for examination to see whether they are accepting, whether they are contesting, or whether they are renegotiating the roles of these major powers, whether they are convincing the U.S. and China to play a different role or not. So, and the method of analysis that I've used is critical discourse analysis. So I have coded the roles for each major power, for role claiming, for alter casting, for contestation, for both U.S. and China. I have coded the themes for the audience. By audience here, I mean the regional states like Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, whether they recognized, contested, or performed some omni-alignment policy to balance their relations between the major powers. And why critical discourse analysis is helpful? Because it helps us pay attention to justificatory vocabularies. Rights, democracies versus sovereignty, development. That helps us a lot to see how these major powers articulated their role, how it was received in the region. So the core empirical pattern that we could see, as I mentioned, was the U.S. and China adopting these two major roles with the bundles that we can see. The U.S. trying to attach values and rights, security partnership, coalitions, leadership, rules-based. When we look at the text, we see at least 2 or 3 of these labels or the themes in the text. But the sequence is different. As I mentioned, the result of the study was that, which was not expected. I was not expecting to see a different sequence, or I was not expecting to see a high level of engagement by regional states, but sequencing changed, and that was somehow, to some extent, based on the input these major powers received from regional states. For China, it's been development, connectivity, sovereignty, non-interference, multipolarity, and governance reform. When we compare the two, we see that in terms of U.S., the sequence of these roles or these labels changes a lot more than when we look at China. So there's more consistency and there's more stability in terms of roles articulation by China. And the point is that, well, we see different administrations, Democratic, Republican in the U.S. In China, it is Xi Jinping. The BRI initiative started in 2011. He's still continuing with the same policy. So there's more stability in terms of articulation of roles in the case of China. But in case of U.S., we see that the sequencing changes a lot. So audience, or the regional states, as I mentioned, sometimes they unbundle these roles. They put different sequences of these roles depending on how they see the regional politics. For example, security talk with the U.S. sometimes is combined with development sovereignty talk with China. Or they add some diversification as a legitimate stance. If they want to, for example, be a partner to U.S. in the region, at the same time they don't want to lose China as a trading partner. So here is the phase one, and this is what I saw when I performed that critical discourse analysis. The normative language frames engagement as support for reform, rights, security, architecture, and provides the mechanism, the capacity building coalitions. This is 2011 to 2016. This is the time when Obama administration was talking about Syria. They were saying that, okay, Assad must go. They were trying to play an active role in terms of democracy promotion in the region. When we look at China texts from 2011-2016, we see that there's a lot of emphasis, as I mentioned, on non-interference, sovereignty function as legitimacy warrants, development cooperation under the BRI initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative was introduced, expanded, lots of strategic cooperation between China and regional states under the BRI initiative. The audience uptake, we saw that there was selective recognition of U.S. security provision. Some states accepted U.S. as a security provider. Some had some cautionary approach. They had their doubts and suspicion. China economic partnership began in 2011, 2012. 2013 was the official introduction of the BRI. And hedging remained implicit and largely couched in balanced relations language. Here I have put some examples of the texts. That's what I mean when I say critical discourse analysis. These are the themes that I have looked for, and this is what I have found. So these are statements by U.S. president, Chinese president, official statements at the UN, or if there has been a speech or interview on regional politics. For China, again, as I mentioned, these are the themes that we could find: non-interference, development, independence, sovereignty. So that's what critical discourse analysis helps us understand about the postures of the two major powers. Second phase, again, U.S. talks about security, stability framing becomes dominant. And rivalry is more explicitly narrated. We all know how Donald Trump talks about rivalry with other countries, particularly with China. Values language often becomes a warrant that follows security and stability claims rather than leading them. For China, we again saw the continuation of the same posture. There is connectivity, development, sovereignty guardrail. These are the issues that we still see China is emphasizing. So the BRI era statecraft becomes more apparent in Chinese texts, particularly in 2017, 2020. It was after there was this nuclear deal between Iran, P5+1. China could have more expanded relationships with Iran. At the same time, they didn't want to alienate Saudi Arabia, so they had these strategic comprehensive agreement between these two regional powers. The regional uptake, again, the important part of the study, how regional states reacted to these two major powers during 2017 to 2020, was that hedging becomes more visible. That's the time that I mentioned earlier, that regional states felt a little bit insecure. They realized that, well, perhaps the traditional security provider, the United States, is not as reliable as we thought about it. So they started hedging between China and U.S. And of course, China was the rising power who also showed some different types of roles playing in the region. And of course, regional states, what they feared about the U.S. role articulation about promoting democratic norms, but in the case of China, they always saw the emphasis on non-interference in domestic politics. That was, again, another assurance for regional states that, okay, maybe China is a more reliable partner because they don't want to mess with our domestic politics. So we see that regional texts endorse strategic partnerships with both while avoiding exclusive commitments. And there is some autonomy talk increasing in foreign policy texts. Again, some examples. I'm not going to read all of them, but this is just an example of the texts that I have examined, how U.S. Was articulating its role during the second phase. Again, we see that, for example, when they talk about Iran, they talk about a corrupt dictatorship. In Chinese texts, we never see anything criticizing the political system of the countries. They just look for trade partners, regardless of the system, the political system that is in place in these countries. So for China, as I mentioned, it's like regional economic cooperation architecture. China started promoting those regional organizations. Shanghai Cooperation Organization was getting more members, and other multilateral arrangements were again growing based on Chinese initiative. The third phase, 2021, 2024, we saw some sort of, thank you, we saw some sort of going back to rules-based order narrative by the U.S. And there was some efforts to maintain the coalition with partners in the region. So narratives intensified. Again, values, rules, coalition language was more strongly linked to responsible regional alignment choices. So in that point of time, during the third phase, we see that the U.S. was not really happy when regional states were doing hedging, trying to balance their relations between U.S. and China. So U.S. became somehow critical of the regional states about how they are actually accepting Chinese role in the region. The example is again about Hawaii doing telecommunication in UAE, something that U.S. was very much critical of. China, they continued again with the same narrative about modernization, multipolar reform horizon. So again, the same role of developmental partner was narrated, and they emphasized on sovereignty, non-interference. Regional states, the regional uptake was still hedging became more explicit. The regional communique tried to normalize the diversification. Joe Biden was not as hawkish as Donald Trump for regional states, so the regional states found the opportunity to normalize the diversification of their partnership between U.S. and China. Here are again some samples of the texts, and as I mentioned, the focus of the paper was basically about articulation of roles by major powers. That's why I've just put the samples about U.S. and China. I haven't included the samples about how regional states actually accepted these roles. So the result of this discourse analysis was that this was the persistent bundles. Here in the table, you can see that 2011 to 2016, if you look at the order or the sequencing of the roles or the labels that each of them have used, it has changed. From 2011, it was values, rights, then security partnership, and then leadership. For US, 2017 to 2020, we have security, stability, then partnerships, coalitions, then values as warrant. In 2021, we see that rules-based order plus coalition maintenance, values intensified. So that's what I mentioned in the beginning, that the sequencing of these roles or the bundle changed in the course of time. Again, we see more consistency in the case of China: sovereignty, non-interference, development cooperation, UN-centered order, connectivity, development, sovereignty guardrail, anti-coercion critique, and in 2021 to 2024, development, modernization, sovereignty, multipolar reform horizon. There's a little bit more consistency in the case of China. So the audience logic is most continuous. Regional actors selectively recognized across these bundles, normalized diversification as legitimate, especially in phase 3. As I mentioned, this is during Biden administration, where regional states could actually find the opportunity to normalize the diversification, which was very much resisted during Trump's presidency, the first term. So the important finding was the audience agency, how they recognized, how they contested, and how they actually hedged. From 2011 to 2004 to 2024, we see more hedging towards the end of this time frame. So I put some examples here, but I haven't put the text here. Like in terms of recognition, we see regional states in 2011 to 2016. There was lots of strategic partnership talks by regional states, support for initiative, endorsement of sovereignty, non-interference language. Contestation: some regional states rejected the roles very explicitly, resisted conditionality, or insisted on non-interference. And for hedging, we see that there are lots of political texts by regional states, foreign policy statements by states in the region that focus on balanced relations. They don't want to alienate any of these two major powers. And the implications for Middle East diplomacy. Of course, we can see that regional actors keep rivalry bounded. As I said, major powers get to choose their roles, but in terms of how much freedom they have to perform that role in the region, they're bounded by the regional states to some extent. For regional strategy, hedging or omni-alignment is not a temporary way station. We see that it has become more common practice in foreign policy of regional states. More and more states like Qatar, like UAE and Kuwait try to actually lean towards hedging and omni-alignment rather than accepting or contesting the roles of the major powers. For U.S.-China diplomacy, we can see that influence cannot be read off material leverage alone. Role claims can be narrowed or hybridized by calibrated audience uptake. So even dependence is high. For analysts, of course, they can track not only who did what, but what can be justified. So a lot has been done by major powers, particularly by the United States. But was it justified? Was it well received by regional states? It's another story. And I'll try to get to my final slide before time runs out. So the conceptual contribution of the paper is about how we reframe strategic competition as contested discursive project, rather than just material power rivalry between the two major powers. So we are also trying to put this in the context of a triadic configuration. It's not just a dyadic competition between two major powers. Regional states also play a role in terms of legitimating the roles of major powers. And methodological role theory plus critical discourse analysis, it operationalizes role mechanisms with a coding family, multi-genre corpus. It enables phase comparison when we are looking at different phases, 2011 to 2016, 2017 to 2020, and then 2021 to 24. That helps us a lot. Like with discourse analysis, we can compare the results of these different phases. And in terms of role theory, we can say that, okay, role contestation is very much important. I just quickly point to the next step. As I mentioned, this is the overarching paper covering the discursive narrative of US and China, but then I'm going to have separate papers for each of states in the region, for Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. And we're happy to have Dr. Ahmed Mansour to discuss it. Dr. Ahmed is assistant professor in the Critical Security Studies program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. His research interests focus on the social foundations of international politics, particularly regional orders and regional rivalries, narrative analysis, and security studies. He also examines West Africa's multifaceted relations with China, and his forthcoming book is titled Why Regional Orders Do Not Transform. You have up to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, for the presentation. And also, I would like to thank Hani for the invitation and the Arab Center for hosting me to give a talk about or to discuss, the paper. محسن, thank you very much for the opportunity also to read and really think about the topic. And thank you for allowing me to present some of my ideas on the issue that I'm sure will be part of a broader discussion. I liked reading the paper because it made me think of issues that I want to engage with. Narrative analysis, rivalry analysis, critical discourse analysis, and all that I frame within the critical reading of those really fields. So I'm going to follow the organization of the paper in my commentary. The paper is very ambitious. It tries to pull ideas from many disciplines, and I think that's really important to have this really debate. And I'm going to highlight some issues that could be modified or attended to in the debates within these fields. Again, following on the organization that you have in the paper, with my sort of advice that you think of anchoring the paper in a tradition or in a field. Because as such is trying to be omnivorous, and that might lead away from focus on one of the set of engagements or really dialogues in any one of these fields. And I will try to have this, don't let this really fool you, because I'm old and I forget, so I try to have my ideas down on paper. I'll try to have my input additive, so I'll work again with those highlights and then tell you how they link across those moments. So the first point that you bring out, the first field, is rivalry and great power relations. Now, the paper makes a very interesting intervention in the study of rivalry, which is how it's discursively built, negotiated, and changed. So, and that I advise you to engage with the literature on rivalry, which, by the way, is not derivative of IR paradigms. It's a research field that is built on empirical analysis of patterns, of politics. That's very important, really, commentary. So you make a clear distinction in the paper on pages 4 and 5, and you say, conceptual work shows that strategic competition is itself a contested term that performs analytical and political functions, shaping which forms of rivalry appear normal, necessary, or responsible. So you make an explicit distinction between strategic competition and rivalry. Why? And I'm here not being pedantic, but I would like to understand if you have a clear theoretical distinctions between the two. Because again, it all depends on what you're really engaging. I think I would really advise you to look at the literature on rivalry. I mean, you said the work of Buzan, that you might find more sort of engagement with scholars of rivalry that have sought to expand this research field. So you have Bill Thompson, Paul Diehl, Gary Gertz, and others. You bring in, and so the second point here in rivalry, you bring in Middle East states, and you tell us about why they sort of constitute part of a triadic relationship that my friend Marwan wrote about. But so again, being honest to the study of rivalry and to its ontological really pillars, the state, I want to understand how you conceptualize this third angle or the leg, so the Middle Eastern states. And I'll tell you why in a minute, why that's important, right? So we think of them as actors, we think of them as a group of actors, and if you want to do that, then that's interesting because you're expanding the study of rivalry into thinking of bundles of actors, as you would say, but I'm not sure how theoretically that is achievable here in this paper. Second is role theory. Again, the issue that merits attention is the audience, right? In role theory, the sort of role demand, because there is a lot of analysis of role supply. As you say, there's a menu of choice, Holst's really famous roles, do this, do that, but what about the audience? How do they interact with those roles? However, role legitimacy that you provide is under-theorized. I'm not convinced of what the analytical purchase is of that construct that you use. And also related to roles, you tell us something very important about audience uptake, but you don't really specify the conditions that help us understand, role success. Under what conditions does recognition stabilize a role, right? Because you talk about role bundles. How does the reality of the audience being fragmented matter, right? This is my comment about the third leg in the dyad. It was really fragmented. Middle Eastern states have different understandings. So how does that matter for the coherence of role or the role bundle that you propose? Narratives. You use role bundles and narrative bundles. So I would suggest also that being clarified. Now, narratives. Tell us how you understand their formation really conceptually before you tell us about the substance. So I would like to read more about how you understand narratives. They're indeed ideational structures that tend to cohere, and they're stable, they're never really constant, and they tend to over policy directions. As you say, they play political roles. Tell us what they are. And I say that for a reason. Narratives are not strategic narratives, right? Strategic narratives are sort of instrumental, and I have but that's my issue, right? They're instrumentalized ideas. They're constellations of ideas that decision makers arguably use to influence something, right? They sell or they market something with it. So my question would be a bit more basic. Why are they able to deploy them in the first place? Meaning, if ideas are deployable and manipulable and instrumentable and could be instrumentalized, why could they be instrumentalized in the first place? Meaning, they should mean something to the audience for them to matter for political intervention. You see what I'm saying? And so that goes back to highlighting the audience that you wanted really to talk about in the beginning. So tell me more about why you think really narratives could be instrumentalized, with my reservation on the idea of strategic narratives. And there's a lot of literature in critical security studies, in international security that engages with how narratives really matter. And they tell us a story of security by looking at sort of why they matter to people and how. Not why they could be instrumentalized, or they are instrumentalized. Narrative bundle, the idea is interesting, it's underdeveloped. So what are the sort of the mechanisms by which a narrative bundle comes to cohere or to organize, as they say. Why and how bundles really stabilize, what makes them durable. So again, we know from narrative analysis why narratives come to cohere and they stabilize, they form, they're really contested, but what about bundles? Do they have certain similar really properties? And what are those properties? Since audience hold different interpretations of the narrative, maybe different also narratives, what causes change in those bundles beyond moments of crises, right? So you do need a theory of change in narrative bundles. So first you tell us about narratives, then strategic narratives, and those bundles. Why do they cohere and how do they change? So now that I told you about rivalry, role theory, narratives, I'm going to come back to why I made a fuss to you in the beginning about rivalry analysis and the distinction with strategic competition. So when you deploy the concepts such as strategic narratives or narratives, I'm reminded that the paper analyzes a very particular set of circumstances in world politics and also related to the region, and that is rivalry. So rivalry is a prolonged security process in which threats are high or perceived threats are high. Stakes are high for the actors. There's a perception of threat. There's an allocation of resources, both ideational, discursive, and also material. And in this really context, there's a sense that the hostility will mean really something important for national security. So what in this relationship matters and how to narrative and narrative formation? Meaning, again, so you're not talking about sort of what's often called low politics. You are talking about a certain really set of relations among the great powers, which means that in those really circumstances, narratives could be prone to be maybe securitized, or the national security construct could be really politicized. So here is why we need to learn more about how you understand really rivalry and as a security process, and where do audiences really matter. Data methods and critical discourse analysis. So you know that there's a corpus list and the coding sheet. I didn't have access to it. I'm very happy to have learned more, and maybe that will help us more unpack it when we read the actual detail. How are the sources that you use? So I have two conceptual note and one empirical note. How are the sources used for you to do critical discourse analysis comparable? Meaning you take some discourses from states, then you take at other times from regional organizations, right? So from the GCC or from the Arab League. How are those rhetorical really materials really comparable? Because in theory, right, what comes out of a regional organization is more negotiated, right? It's a compromise of ideas. It should be different than what comes out of the state in principle. So if they're really similar, tell us methodologically how. Conceptual point two, I really suggest that you look at the medium through which this is all produced, which is the English language. Most of the actors that you look at really communicate in non-English languages, Mandarin or Arabic, Farsi, or something else. Which means that when they communicate in English, what's the audience that they have in mind, and what do they want to send as signals? You say in the paper that I'm interested in high signaling. So when they when they talk in English, are they aware that they're talking to this actor, to this really destination? Might it be really different maybe when you do your interviews and you have research assistants or something, is it really different from the tone in Arabic or in Mandarin, Farsi, or something else, right? So they're strategically signaling, right, with that particular use of language. The most original claim of the paper that I like is regional actors shape legitimacy. That's brilliant. Now, for critical discourse analysis, as we saw, we need more text, right? Text is always bumpy. It's not smooth. So, but you covered really part of that and hope to read about it more. Finally, findings and empirical reactions. I have a few points, 4 points, and I will stop. One, is there a baseline for the analysis? Where do we start from looking at the formation of those bundles and the narratives, right? What is there before 2011? That will help us really understand the starting point of the analysis. Two, what explains the bundles that you have, meaning did you force 3 on the US, 3 on China? Did it emerge out of just by accident? Why did you end up with those role and narrative bundles? 3, and I'm sure the audience really want to ask you about the U.S. as a democracy promoter and the reaction, to that. I'm somewhat really doubtful of the traction of that discourse. But 4, and really finally, I really have a problem. I have a lot of problems, but one of them is with hedging. I'm still yet to be convinced that hedging is something that can help us understand regional politics, at least in the Gulf. And not to be only thrown around, but for hedging to be analytically useful, I think needs 3 steps, 3 moves. 1, I want to read about clear indicators from decision makers. This is the final point. Clear indicators from decision makers, say in the Gulf or in the MENA region, or West Asia, that they are afraid or they see risk or they see real concern in the relationship with the United States. Nothing in passing, something that's really structural. Keep in mind, rivalry is beyond one person's lifetime, which is why we have real rivalries that stay for decades and maybe centuries. So when we talk about decision makers, I want to see something that's more than somebody said something once. So 1, I need to read, or we need really to read more decision makers. 2, following up on the role supply and role demand, I want to read something about those Middle Eastern states. Do they clearly expect and relay from China that they would like to see China replace the US as a security provider? I have yet to read that. 3, the third move is their role supply from China. Is China clearly stating, willing, acting, doing something that says, I will be the security provider that the US will not be able to give or willing to give, or you think is not giving you? With these 3, I will accept hedging as a policy move. Thank you very much for listening to me. Good luck on the work. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad, for this in-depth and engaging discussion. Now we open, before you go back to his comments, we will open the floor to a few questions. Yes, Dr. Ibrahim Frahat.
Thank you for the paper and the presentation, and also for the comments from Ahmad. I will not make a big issue of the hedging, so I'll leave that to you. But I would like to share with you actually that years ago, in all the conversations that we used to have with Chinese scholars, officials and former officials, on the relationship with the U.S. in the Middle East, we were always told with this answer when we asked them about this competition or this rivalry. They always said that we're neither have the interest nor the capability to compete with the U.S. in the Middle East. We're not interested and we cannot do it, right? Now, this in the past couple of years, 2 years, has changed. In my last conversation with some Chinese officials actually in Shanghai just 2 years ago in a visit there, they were talking, actually presenting for the first time that I hear openly that we are presenting a different model for the Middle East, which is different from the US, which is built on development, non-interference. We don't have anything to do with your local cultures or human rights or violations. That's not our business, and partnerships. So this is the model we're presenting that's different from the US. So I think, so on the level of understanding of competition with the US, there is the Chinese understanding that we're moving into that area, and we're presenting this kind of model. And the most interesting development, actually, where I see now is that the competition is moving to another level, is that we started to see some Chinese role in the politics and security as well, right? Whether it's the Iran-Saudi rapprochement deal, or the most alarming, actually, for the US, is that lately with the Trump administration of international actors like Starmer is visiting China. This is big, right? For Starmer, the number one ally of the US is to now start moving towards China. So the Chinese level is on the politics and security. We are seeing multiple indicators that is developing in this area on that level. Now, this is the issue that where I'm struggling with your paper, right, is on the U.S. role, on the other hand, of still promoting values, democracy, human rights, and rules-based order. Are you serious? Right? This is, I'm not sure actually that you are serious, right, about the U.S. role. This is over a long time ago, right? This is no longer the case, right? Actually, the party that dismantling the rules-based order now is the U.S. actively and aggressively, is the Trump administration. And no, it's not specific to the Trump administration, because a lot of the damage that Trump is causing to the rules-based order is irreversible. Like the damage that he created in the first administration in the Middle East, all the damage was not replaced or reversed, though it was followed by a Democratic Biden-led administration, right? So we need to check the basic assumptions in the paper, right? About I have a serious problem with it, that to present the U.S. right, presenting a model that's rules-based order, values, democracy, human rights, right, at this age, right? By the way, even before the Trump administration, that wasn't the case, right? This model was just the soft power for the U.S. to have access to different places, right? We know that, for example, I can give you from the Democratic administration, Biden administration, of his election campaign of declaring Saudi Arabia as a pariah state and holding them accountable, right? And with the start of the Ukraine war, is coming for Saudi Arabia to replace, the Russian gas and all of that. So we have a serious problem with the basic assumptions of the model of presenting the U.S., especially now. It wasn't even before, but especially now as presenting human rights, development, values-based, and all of that, compared to the evolving security and politics role of China that's not recognized enough in your paper. And I'm sorry that I took.
Thank you. Dr. Mohammed Al-Masri.
As a matter of fact, after the intervention of Dr. Ibrahim, he covered all of the areas. My question was about, is China going to invest in the security of the region, which was asked by Dr. Ibrahim. But since you give me the chance, I don't think that Dr. Mohsen was saying that the United States foreign policy is promoting democracy, human rights. He said that the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East would prefer China because they don't interfere in the internal politics in China. And therefore, I want to thank you very much and to compliment, and it was a brilliant presentation, well organized, well argued, and it was educational for me. And I think Dr. Ibrahim, having all of these questions due to the in-depth presentation that you gave us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions? I think you still have a lot to do with this.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate all the comments, the evaluation, or the criticism. That was very helpful, definitely, because this is the first draft of the paper, so I can now revise particular issues in the paper. But I'll start with the last comment from Dr. Ibrahim, that whether U.S. claiming that they are promoting democratic norms or values, if you ask me as an individual, Iranian-born, Australian citizen, I would say this is fairy tales, doesn't exist at all. If you ask an American who is constructing the U.S. narrative, yes, they say, oh, we are promoting democracy. So I'm not putting my own words here in the paper. I'm looking at U.S. official narratives, their narratives. And in the beginning of the presentation, I said that I'm not truth testing here. I'm not saying whether the roles that they claim they want to perform, they do in reality. Most of the time, that's just the story that they're telling, and there are lots of things behind it. But
it changed.
Of course, yeah. So promoting democratic norms never has happened, of course. I 100% agree with you that this is just about like storytelling for public view, for legitimizing their action in the region.
But they're not even saying it now. Right? Now they're not saying it.
Yeah. Even now, that was actually a good point, because I want to point to current negotiations between Iran and Trump administration. One item of the agenda added to the negotiations is human rights. So they are saying that now. They point to human rights values. Again, does that really matter? Of course not. The important issue is missiles capability, nuclear issue, regional policies of Iran. But that is an added item on the agenda. So again, it is still part of the narrative right now, today, that they're doing negotiations. It is one agenda item that they're discussing. And from there, I want to get to the point that Dr. Ahmad mentioned about why narratives are actually examined here. And is it about the strategic policy of these major powers? No, but they do promote these narratives because they want to gain legitimacy. Does it really matter to them if they get legitimacy? If they gain that, yes, it does. If they don't, doesn't matter. Again, the very good example is 2003 when they wanted to invade Iraq. The plan was there. They wanted to invade Iraq no matter who agrees or doesn't agree. But they went to the Security Council to gain legitimacy. They talked about human rights issues.
From who?
U.S. So
From whom did they want to gain legitimacy?
International community.
But not the Middle East states.
Back then, no, really the Middle Eastern states didn't matter because they were invading the state in the Middle East. So yes, the narratives matter, but it is not the strategic policy of it doesn't really, it is not the basis for the strategic policy of the countries. But they do need the legitimacy. So I don't believe that these narratives are useless, or they just say that for the sake of argument. They do say that because they believe that legitimacy is important for them. The good example, as I mentioned, was Iraq, 2003. Even right now, Donald Trump doesn't believe in UN or the Security Council, but still they discuss Iran issues at the Security Council because they want to shape the public view, public perception of what U.S. wants to do in the region. Now, and thank you very much for highlighting the rivalry versus competition. I know some of the terminology that I've used in the paper are not consistent, like even hedging and omni-alignment. I started with hedging, and then at the end of the paper, I was pointing to omni-alignment. I asked myself, okay, I have to choose one over the other. So yes, I'll have to take a look at that, and thank you for highlighting the literature on rivalry and competition. You pointed to the audience in the Middle East or the regional states, whether they are acting independently or as a group in response to role adoption by the states. So they're definitely acting independently. We see lots of differences between how Qatar is approaching US and China, how Kuwait, UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia. So each of them have got their own foreign policy strategy. So I can't put them as a group of, like, I can't treat the Middle East as a homogeneous entity responding to the role adoptions by US and China. Because even China as a major power is not treating the region as a whole, as a homogeneous entity. They do approach these multilateral organizations, but basically they have bilateral relations. So they also prefer to have their own business with Qatar separate from the business with Kuwait. So that was the justification that I can't put them as a group.
That's important because it allows us to see how you think or how we should think about legitimation of the narrative bubble.
Yes.
Right? This move is very important, really conceptually.
Yes.
To be really clarified.
And that's perhaps one reason that I want to do separate case studies for each one. Otherwise, I would treat Middle East as a group of states having a unified approach towards these two powers. Yes, narratives as bundles, and of course, I mentioned that I focus on the narratives because they are produced to support the strategic actions of the states. They might be helpful, they might not be helpful. They might work, they might not work. But it is not replacing the strategic policy of the state. So I'm not claiming that these narratives are the foreign policy of the states or the official foreign policy of the states. I'm saying that these narratives try to shape the role conception of these major powers in the region. Bundles of narratives, yes, I have to perhaps clarify that furthermore in the paper, that these are bundles, not just one role adopted by the state.
And they stabilize.
Yes, yeah, and I have to explain more why the sequence, the sequencing changes. That was another valuable point that you mentioned. And the other point that you mentioned about security issue, threat perception, again, in the very beginning, I said that I am trying to not to use mainstream concepts like security, realist assumptions, or liberal assumptions. I just wanted to focus on socially constructed terminology, the roles that these states adopt. So that's why I didn't focus, or I didn't include any perception of threat or security issue. I think there was also a question by Dr. Ibrahim, and also you pointed to that whether China wants to provide security to the states in the region, they haven't claimed such a role at all. So we cannot assign the role to them. No, it has never been claimed by China. They just want to be, they always focus on equal sovereignty, which is totally different from the role U.S. wants to play and claim, of course. So, no, that's not the case for China.
Can I mention something here?
Sure.
Since we're having a discussion and whomever is left might be interested. In 2019, we produced a special issue with the China Quarterly.
Yeah.
And it was about interrogating what intervention means, critically interrogating what it means, by reading the discourses, the practices, right? And we found out that in many ways, you could say you're not intervening. You could say it, right, in your really discourse, but you're actually doing something that plays into local really relations of power. right? And this is where, does it want to, but is it doing it or not? Right, this is what really merits more. So it might say or might not say. So what I mean is that this critical interrogation of what it means to say something and what it's doing.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And again, that's why I just look at the narrative, not the policy action.
Right.
So China provides a lifeline to the Iranian government, yes, but they don't mention it, or they don't claim that they're supporting or they're trying to help the regime to stay in power. So that's why I don't look at the policy action. I just look at the narrative, what they claim. Do they claim rightly or wrongly? Is there any truth to it? Of course not. Maybe there's little degree of truth to what both powers are claiming. But if I want to evaluate the truth or whether it's been what they are doing or is it different from like the policy action, different from narratives, that's not what I wanted to do.
So let me ask you this, since we're having this discussion, and that's very important. So what's the insight then from looking at stories, really, or narratives that might not have a practical implication?
Oh, they do have practical implication in terms of legitimacy. So when, for example, why Donald Trump is doing negotiations with Iran, it's for gaining legitimacy for military action that is coming up later. So why do they don't have the military capability to do it now? Of course they do, but they are trying to gain more legitimacy for what they want to do. So it is somehow as a kind of support for public view and gaining more, perhaps accompanying other states in the region, like say to regional states who are afraid of any military intervention. Look, we did negotiations with Iran, it didn't work. You're not going to complain about that anymore. We have to take action now. So it gives legitimacy. They can attack Iran any moment that they want, but they are waiting for the right moment that they have exhausted all these diplomatic options, and everybody would believe that, yes, U.S. has no choice but to attack Iran. And, okay, and...
1 minute.
Okay. What was before 2011, that was a good point also. I have to add a little bit of background why I'm starting, I have to justify the time frame. Yes, thank you so much for that.
Thank you both for this engaging, frank, and really interesting presentation. Thank you for your time and for making this trip and sharing with us. Yes, thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming first day of Ramadan.
Yes, and for bearing with us to the end.
Yes.
And thank you, Dr. Ahmad, for this wonderful discussion. Thank you all, and once again, Ramadan Kareem to all.